Tonight, the first topic we explore is the life of John Fitzgerald Kennedy, the 35th President of the United States. A man born into wealth but forged through pain. From sickly childhood days in a hospital bed to facing down nuclear annihilation with nothing but courage and charm. JFK's story isn't just a presidential biography. It's a glimpse into one of the most mythologized lives of the 20th century. So, before you get comfortable, as always, take a moment to like the video and subscribe to the channel only if you enjoy our content. Also, let us know where you're watching from and what time it is for you. Sometimes our stories are too interesting, and we are working on some boring ones. It's time now to dim the lights, turn on a fan for some noise, and let's cover what we have for tonight together. John Fitzgerald Kennedy entered the world on May 29, 1917, in the affluent Boston suburb of Brookline, Massachusetts. He was the second son of Joseph P. Kennedy Sr. and Rose Fitzgerald, both hailing from powerful Irish-American dynasties. His birth seemed destined for greatness, but from the start Jack's life was anything but easy. What the public would later see as charisma and strength was in reality built upon a lifetime of silent battles with illness and expectation. As a child, Jack was frail. At just 3 years old, he contracted scarlet fever, a nearly fatal disease at the time, which nearly took his life and left his immune system battered. Throughout his youth, he would suffer from chronic back pain, frequent colds, and mysterious ailments that puzzled doctors, yet he rarely let it show. Instead of sulking, Jack used his long recoveries to read voraciously. He loved stories about heroism, adventure, and ancient history, tales that transported him far from the confines of sickbeds and sterile rooms. The Kennedy household was intense. Joe Kennedy Sr. was a towering figure, driven, ambitious, and determined to see his family rise to the pinnacle of American power. He made his fortune in finance and film, and when politics called, he accepted a diplomatic post in London. But it was always clear the real legacy he cared about wasn't his own. It was his children's, especially his sons. Jack's older brother, Joe Jr., was the star. Athletic, handsome, confident. Everyone assumed he would be president one day. Jack, by contrast, was smaller, thinner, and less physically robust. But he had something even more potent: wit, curiosity, and a quiet inner resilience that grew with every hospital stay and setback. At school, Jack was mischievous and charming, but never quite top of the class, not because he wasn't smart, but because his health often pulled him away. Still, he managed to earn his way into Choate, a prestigious prep school, where he began to emerge from his brother's shadow. Teachers noted his intelligence. Classmates remembered his dry humor and keen sense of observation. No one suspected that this sickly second son would one day hold the nuclear codes or charm the world with a smile that hid decades of pain. But Jack Kennedy was learning something far more valuable than just politics or academics: how to endure. As the 1930s gave way to the storm of global war, John F. Kennedy stood at a crossroads. He had just graduated from Harvard in 1940 with a thesis, turned bestseller titled Why England Slept, a bold analysis of British appeasement. Before World War II, while most sons of privilege might have used that as a stepping stone to academia or diplomacy, Jack had a different path in mind: service. Despite his chronic back problems, Kennedy was determined to fight. He used his family's influence to secure a commission in the U.S. Navy, a move that many questioned given his physical condition. But Jack wasn't interested in watching history unfold. He wanted to shape it. And so, in 1943, Lieutenant Kennedy was sent to the South Pacific, where his quiet courage would define him. While commanding a patrol torpedo boat, PT-109, Jack and his crew found themselves in one of the most harrowing episodes of the war. In the dead of night, a Japanese destroyer rammed their small craft, splitting it in two and throwing the men into shark-infested waters. 2 crew members died instantly. The rest clung to debris. Here's where the myth of JFK was born. Not from speeches, but sweat and grit. With his injured back screaming in pain, Kennedy swam over 3 miles, towing a wounded sailor by a life jacket strap clenched between his teeth. For the next 6 days, he led his men through the jungle, surviving on coconuts and hope until they were finally rescued. For his leadership, Kennedy was awarded the Navy and Marine Corps Medal, but the deeper impact was internal. He had faced death and survived. He had proven himself not just to his father or his country, but to himself. The fragile boy was gone, replaced by a man who understood duty, sacrifice, and the weight of command. Returning home a war hero, Kennedy's story quickly became the stuff of legend. Reporters praised his bravery. The public fell in love with his modesty and good looks, and his father, Joe Sr., wasted no time. He saw the window wide open. If Joe Jr. had been the plan, Jack was now the destiny. The political machine would begin to turn, and it would turn with Jack at its center. When John F. Kennedy returned from the war, he brought with him more than medals. He carried the gravitas of someone who had faced death and come out wiser. While still physically fragile, Jack had developed a quiet authority, one that people noticed instantly. His father, ever the strategist, sensed the timing was perfect. America was rebuilding, and voters were hungry for new faces, fresh voices, and war heroes they could believe in. In 1946, just a year after the war ended, Jack launched his political career by running for Congress in Massachusetts' 11th District. He was only 29 years old. Though many assumed he'd ride purely on his family name and wealth, Jack surprised them. He campaigned with intensity, shaking hands, visiting factories, and engaging with working-class citizens in ways that felt genuine. His war record earned him respect, but it was his charm and sharp intellect that won hearts. He won the election handily, stepping into the House of Representatives at a time when post-war America was redefining itself. But Kennedy wasn't content to remain a backbencher. In speeches, he questioned orthodoxies, challenged party lines, and positioned himself as a thoughtful, independent Democrat. Over 6 years in the House, Jack learned the art of politics, how to listen, when to speak, and what to avoid. By 1952, his sights were set higher. He challenged Henry Cabot Lodge Jr., a Republican incumbent, for a seat in the U.S. Senate. The race was fierce, expensive, and closely watched. Jack's sisters and mother campaigned tirelessly, and his father funded a media blitz unlike anything Massachusetts had seen. The strategy paid off. Kennedy won, defeating Lodge in a stunning upset. As a senator, Jack continued to grow in stature, but he still battled severe health issues in private: Addison's disease, a dangerous adrenal disorder, and worsening back pain. He underwent risky spinal surgeries that left him near death at one point, but the public knew almost nothing. The Kennedy mystique was carefully protected. Despite it all, Jack's political star only rose. His speeches began to echo with national ambition. He was photogenic, eloquent, and young in an era yearning for a new direction. A book, Profiles in Courage, won him a Pulitzer Prize, but behind the glamour, he was already planning his next move, the presidency. By the late 1950s, John F. Kennedy had become one of the most recognizable figures in American politics. He was young, articulate, and polished, a refreshing contrast to the older, more conservative political establishment. Behind the scenes, he was working relentlessly. Though his health remained fragile and his back often left him in agony, Kennedy was singularly focused on one goal: becoming President of the United States. In 1960, at just 42 years old, he officially announced his candidacy for the Democratic nomination. Skeptics were quick to circle. He was too young, too inexperienced, too Catholic. America had never elected a Catholic president, and anti-Catholic sentiment still ran deep in many parts of the country. But Kennedy and his campaign leaned into the criticism and transformed it into strength. "I am not the Catholic candidate for president," he famously declared. "I am the Democratic Party's candidate for president, who also happens to be a Catholic." The campaign was sharp, modern, and built for television, a medium Jack mastered with ease. His team understood optics, charisma, and the power of clear messaging. Meanwhile, his opponent, Vice President Richard Nixon, carried a reputation for political cunning but lacked Kennedy's calm magnetism. The tipping point came during the first ever televised presidential debate. Nixon appeared pale and visibly uncomfortable, while Kennedy exuded confidence, charm, and poise. For the first time, American voters weren't just listening, they were watching, and they liked what they saw. The election was one of the closest in U.S. history, but on November 8, 1960, Kennedy emerged victorious. At 43, he became the youngest man ever elected president and the first Catholic to hold the office. His inauguration in January 1961 drew massive crowds. The speech he delivered became instantly iconic. "Ask not what your country can do for you. Ask what you can do for your country." To many, it felt like a new era had begun, one of vitality, vision, and hope. The Kennedy White House would soon be nicknamed Camelot, a term borrowed from Arthurian legend, evoking the sense of grace, charm, and almost mythic promise. But behind the glittering image lay immense challenges, foreign and domestic, that would test Jack's leadership to its very core. And the world would be watching. John F. Kennedy entered the White House with soaring expectations, but he quickly discovered that the presidency was far less forgiving than the campaign trail. Within just 3 months of taking office, he faced his first major test, and it would become one of the most embarrassing foreign policy blunders in U.S. history. The plan, inherited from the Eisenhower administration, involved a CIA-apt invasion of Cuba. The goal was to overthrow Fidel Castro, the newly entrenched communist leader just 90 miles from American shores. The strategy: train a group of Cuban exiles, land them covertly at the Bay of Pigs, spark an uprising, and topple the regime. Simple on paper, disastrous in execution. On April 17, 1961, the invasion began and fell apart almost immediately. Castro's forces were prepared. The Cuban population didn't rise in support, and U.S. air support was withheld to maintain deniability. The exiles were captured or killed, and within days, the operation had failed spectacularly. The global press seized on the moment. America looked clumsy. Kennedy looked naive. Critics pounced. Allies doubted. Enemies mocked. And for the first time, Kennedy's calm exterior began to crack, at least behind closed doors. He was furious at the CIA, at his advisors, and at himself. He had approved the plan, and now the weight of the failure rested on his shoulders. But here was where JFK began to show a different kind of leadership. Rather than deflect blame, Kennedy publicly took full responsibility. "Victory has 100 fathers," he said, "but defeat is an orphan." His approval ratings actually rose. Americans respected the honesty, the accountability. He had stumbled, but he had stood back up. Privately, though, the Bay of Pigs haunted him. It shook his trust in military advisors and intelligence reports. It made him wary of quick solutions and overconfident planners, and it planted a seed that would bear fruit in the tense months ahead, when missteps wouldn't just cost reputation, but risk global annihilation. From that point forward, Kennedy vowed never to be blindly led again. The lesson was bitter, but necessary. In the nuclear age, decisions made in secret rooms could shake the world. And next time, he'd be ready, because next time the world would be even closer to the edge. In October 1962, John F. Kennedy faced a moment that no American president had encountered before: the very real possibility of nuclear war. It began with photographs. High-altitude U-2 spy planes had flown over Cuba and captured unmistakable evidence. The Soviet Union was installing nuclear missile sites just 90 miles off the coast of Florida. Missiles that, once operational, could strike nearly every major U.S. city in minutes. The stakes were unimaginable. Kennedy and his advisors, known as XCOM, gathered in secrecy to decide how to respond. The military wanted immediate airstrikes, followed by an invasion. Others urged diplomacy. But JFK remembered the Bay of Pigs. He knew how quickly things could spiral when fueled by poor judgment and unchecked aggression. He chose a different path: a naval quarantine to prevent further Soviet shipments to Cuba. It wasn't officially called a blockade, because that would have been considered an act of war. But the message was clear: no more missiles, or the U.S. would act. For 13 days, the world held its breath. Soviet ships approached the blockade line. American forces went to DEFCON 2, one step from all-out war. Across the globe, people stocked bomb shelters and waited. In Washington, Kennedy kept a calm face in public, while privately battling the weight of every decision. One misstep, one misread telegram, and millions could die. Then, in a remarkable back-channel exchange, Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev offered a deal. The Soviets would remove their missiles from Cuba in exchange for a public U.S. promise not to invade the island and a secret agreement to remove American missiles from Turkey. Kennedy accepted. The crisis ended. The missiles were withdrawn. War was averted. The Cuban Missile Crisis became Kennedy's defining moment, not because of bold aggression, but because of careful restraint. He had stood his ground, but allowed a path for his enemy to back down without humiliation. He learned that true leadership wasn't about victory through force, but survival through wisdom. Afterward, both superpowers installed direct communication, the hotline between Washington and Moscow, and Kennedy, more than ever, became a voice for peace. But he also knew something chilling. The world had come closer to nuclear destruction than most people would ever realize, and the clock would always be ticking. After the Cuban Missile Crisis, John F. Kennedy emerged not only as a skilled tactician, but as a president with renewed moral clarity. He had stared into the abyss and pulled the world back from it. But he knew that leading a nation wasn't just about foreign threats. It was about forging a better future at home. And so, in the final year of his presidency, Kennedy's focus shifted inward toward justice, equality, and what he called the new frontier. At the heart of this vision was civil rights. The struggle for racial equality had long been simmering, and by 1963 it was boiling. Across the South, segregation remained entrenched. Peaceful protesters were being met with dogs, fire hoses, and violence. Kennedy had been cautious on civil rights early in his presidency, wary of alienating Southern Democrats, but events were changing him when federal troops had to be sent to force desegregation in Southern universities, and when civil rights activist Medgar Evers was assassinated. Kennedy could no longer stay silent. On June 11, 1963, he addressed the nation. His voice was calm, but his words were revolutionary. "We are confronted primarily with a moral issue," he said. "It is as old as the scriptures and as clear as the American Constitution. For the first time, a sitting president fully embraced the moral argument for civil rights." That same year, the world watched as 250,000 people gathered at the Lincoln Memorial. It was the March on Washington, where Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. delivered his legendary "I Have a Dream" speech. Kennedy met with King afterward, privately supporting the march despite political risks. Meanwhile, JFK's vision expanded to other frontiers. He championed space exploration, famously declaring that America would land a man on the moon before the decade was out. It wasn't just about science or Cold War pride. It was about pushing the boundaries of human achievement. It was about proving what a free society could do when it dared to dream. And yet, behind the bold speeches and televised optimism, Jack's body was deteriorating. He lived with constant pain, hidden from the public eye. But he pressed forward with charm, with hope, and with a clear sense that time for all of us was finite. His new frontier was just beginning, but fate had other plans. It was a bright Friday morning in Dallas, Texas. President John F. Kennedy arrived in the city as part of a political tour to bolster support for the upcoming 1964 election. The trip was meant to be routine: motorcades, handshakes, speeches. Kennedy, alongside his wife Jacqueline, greeted the crowd from an open-top limousine, his smile beaming, the city buzzing with excitement. But within moments, that joy would turn to horror. At 12:30 p.m., as the motorcade passed the Texas School Book Depository, shots rang out. Chaos erupted. Jacqueline Kennedy turned to her husband in confusion, her face frozen in fear. John F. Kennedy had been struck. A bullet entered through his upper back and exited near his throat. A second shot, fatal, hit his head. He collapsed into Jackie's lap as the car sped to Parkland Memorial Hospital. Doctors fought to save him, but the wounds were catastrophic. At 1 p.m., John F. Kennedy was pronounced dead. He was just 46 years old. Back in Washington, the nation fell into stunned silence. People cried openly in the streets. Schools closed. Businesses paused. For many, it felt like the very soul of America had been torn apart. The youthful, inspiring leader who had spoken of hope, space, and civil rights was gone in an instant. Vice President Lyndon B. Johnson was sworn in as president aboard Air Force One just hours later, with a blood-stained Jacqueline Kennedy standing at his side, still in shock, refusing to change her clothes. "I want them to see what they did to Jack," she reportedly said. The accused assassin, Lee Harvey Oswald, was arrested within hours, but just 2 days later, he too was shot and killed on live television by nightclub owner Jack Ruby. Conspiracy theories exploded. Was it the Soviets? The CIA? The Mafia? Decades later, the full truth remains debated, but one fact is indisputable: the loss was profound. John F. Kennedy's funeral was a national moment of mourning. Foreign dignitaries walked in solemn procession. A riderless horse led the way, and in the silence of Arlington National Cemetery, little John saluted his father's casket, a gesture forever etched into America's memory. The dream of Camelot was over. The world had stopped in Dallas. In the years following his death, John F. Kennedy's life transformed from political biography into enduring myth. The man who once walked the halls of the White House became a symbol of youth, of hope, of what might have been. His presidency, though tragically brief at just over 1,000 days, left an imprint that continues to shape American identity and global politics. Many remember him first for his words, soaring, idealistic, unforgettable. "Ask not what your country can do for you" became more than a quote. It was a call to action that inspired a generation. His speeches elevated civic duty to something noble, making ordinary people feel like they were part of something larger, something historic. And in that way, he succeeded not just as a leader, but as a unifier. In foreign policy, Kennedy's greatest triumph wasn't victory, it was restraint. During the Cuban Missile Crisis, his refusal to act rashly may have saved the world. His approach to diplomacy, grounded in realism, but reaching for peace, laid the groundwork for future arms, control agreements, and a brief thaw in Cold War tensions. His vision for space, realized years after his death, led to humanity's first steps on the moon, and that to bore his name. Domestically, his legacy is more complex. His full civil rights agenda would only pass after his death under Lyndon B. Johnson. And yet it was Kennedy who shifted the moral tone of the presidency, who elevated the conversation, and who stood at last on the side of equality when it mattered. But perhaps Kennedy's most lasting legacy isn't found in policy or politics. It's in the image, the young president, full of promise. The father playing with his children in the Oval Office. The man who endured constant pain with a smile. The leader whose life was cut short, leaving behind a haunting silence. And the eternal question, what if? Today, his image adorns coins and memorials. His name graces schools, airports, and libraries, but his real monument is carved into memory, into the idea that leadership can be intelligent and inspiring, that even in a broken world, a better future can be imagined, and that sometimes the brightest lights shine the shortest, long before espresso machines hissed and coffee shops lined every street corner. Coffee began its journey in a place few people would expect, the ancient highlands of Ethiopia. Here, according to legend, a curious goat herder named Kaldi noticed something strange among his flock. His goats, after nibbling on the bright red berries of a certain wild shrub, began leaping with unusual energy, bleating and bounding through the hills like they'd been struck by lightning. Kaldi, intrigued, decided to try the berries himself. What followed, the story claims, was a burst of clarity and wakefulness that would change history. Though Kaldi didn't know it at the time, word of this magical plant spread to a nearby monastery, where monks experimented by boiling the berries into a bitter brew. They soon found it helped them stay awake through long hours of evening prayer. The bean, it seemed, had spiritual potential. Whether or not Kaldi and his hyperactive goats ever truly existed, historians agree that coffee's roots do trace back to Ethiopia. The plant Coffea arabica is native to the region and has grown there wild for centuries. Locals likely chewed the beans or mixed them with animal fat to create an early form of energy bite, long before brewing was ever imagined. From Ethiopia, coffee coffee made its way across the Red Sea to the Arabian Peninsula, most notably to Yemen. By the 15th century, it had found a new identity, no longer just a stimulant, but a drink prepared through roasting and brewing, much closer to what we recognize today. Yemen's Sufi mystics used the dark, energizing liquid to aid in their rituals, helping them stay awake during all-night chants and meditations. The drink was called koa, a word once used for wine, signaling the seriousness with which it was regarded. Coffee was not just a drink. It was an experience, a ritual, a bridge between the mundane and the divine. This transformation marked the beginning of coffee's long cultural journey. From a wild shrub in Ethiopia to the spiritual centers of Yemen, coffee was already more than a beverage. It was becoming a force, one that would stir minds, fuel ideas, and eventually change the world. By the 15th century, coffee had firmly rooted itself in the heart of the Islamic world. Its journey across the Red Sea brought it to Yemen, where Sufi mystics embraced it not just as a drink, but as a spiritual tool. In their dimly lit chambers, the rhythmic chanting of prayers was often accompanied by the warmth of freshly brewed koa. It sharpened the mind, banished drowsiness, and allowed devotees to reach deeper states of spiritual focus. Coffee in this context was divine fuel. From Yemen, the bean made its way north to Mecca, Medina, and Cairo, the great centers of Islamic culture. And with it came the rise of something revolutionary, the coffee house known as kava cane. These establishments weren't just places to sip a cup. They were the birthplaces of conversation, music, poetry, and debate. Men gathered to discuss religion, politics, philosophy, and literature. Coffee became the drink of thought, a companion to the mind. Nowhere did coffee culture flourish more brilliantly than in Istanbul, the beating heart of the Ottoman Empire. By the 16th century, coffee houses had become a cornerstone of urban life. Lavishly decorated, they hosted chess matches, shadow puppet shows, and intense philosophical exchanges. The Ottomans elevated coffee into an art. Roasting techniques improved. Brewing methods were refined. The coffee pot, or sazve, became a common household item. But not everyone was delighted. As with all things that stir thought and bring people together, coffee attracted suspicion. Some religious scholars denounced it, likening its stimulating effect to intoxication, forbidden under Islamic law. Coffee houses were periodically banned, accused of breeding sedition and political unrest. Authorities feared that too many awake minds in one room might conspire against them. Despite these crackdowns, the popularity of coffee only grew. People smuggled beans and brewed in secret. The bans, often short-lived, were eventually lifted. The Ottoman sultans themselves became avid coffee drinkers. In less than a century, coffee had evolved from a monk's midnight aid to a cultural cornerstone of the Islamic world. It had sparked controversy, invited curiosity, and most importantly, it had brought people together. And that momentum was only just beginning. For centuries, the Arab world guarded coffee like a state secret. Yemen traders carefully exported roasted or boiled beans, ensuring that no fertile seed could sprout elsewhere. They understood what they had, not just a plant, but a cultural treasure and a powerful economic monopoly. But in the 1600s, that wall of exclusivity began to crack. The first known breach came through a daring act of botanical smuggling. According to legend, an Indian Sufi named Baba Budan visited Mecca on pilgrimage and fell in love with the drink. On his return journey, he strapped 7 raw coffee seeds to his chest, hidden beneath his robe. Back home in the hills of southern India, He planted the seeds, unknowingly setting off a global transformation. Those plants would become the ancestors of entire coffee empires. At the same time, European merchants, especially those from Venice and the Dutch East India Company, were becoming deeply curious about the mysterious black beverage popular in Islamic lands. They saw opportunity and profit. Soon, coffee found its way into European ports, first in Venice, then in Marseille, London, and Amsterdam. At first, it was exotic and rare, sold by apothecaries as a medicinal tonic believed to cure everything from gout to melancholy. But coffee didn't remain a curiosity for long. By the mid-17th century, coffee houses were sprouting across Europe, echoing their Ottoman counterparts. In London, these establishments quickly became known as penny universities for the cost of a cup. One could engage in lively discussions with merchants, philosophers, and poets. Coffee fueled minds, sharpened wit, and became synonymous with intellectual exchange. Not everyone approved. Much like in the Islamic world, European authorities grew suspicious. Some saw coffee houses as dens of dissent. In 1675, King Charles II of England even tried to ban them, declaring that they spread false news. The public backlash was swift and loud, and the decree was quietly dropped. Meanwhile, the Dutch succeeded in cultivating coffee on the island of Java, in what is now Indonesia. This marked the true globalization of the crop, a turning point from local tradition to global commodity. Europe had fallen for coffee, and soon the whole world would follow, each culture adding its own rituals, roasts, and revolutions to the byproduct. By the 18th century, coffee wasn't just a drink. It was a movement. In the great cities of Europe, coffee houses had become the engines of thought, dissent, and innovation. These weren't mere shops for refreshment. They were gathering spaces for the restless and the brilliant. Writers, thinkers, rebels, and traders filled them, exchanging ideas over steaming cups of dark brew. In London, over 500 coffee houses thrived by the 1700s. Each had its own personality. Some catered to artists, others to merchants, scientists, or politicians. Isaac Newton and Edmund Halley debated astronomy at one. Lloyd's Coffee House became the birthplace of modern insurance. Across the street from Westminster, Parliament members sipped coffee before heading into heated debates. Unlike taverns, which dulled the senses with ale, coffee sharpened minds and quickened speech. This was the age of enlightenment, and coffee was its liquid fuel. In France, cafes became salons of revolution. By the time the French Revolution neared its boiling point, coffee houses buzzed with fiery speeches and pamphlet reading. The famous Café Procope in Paris hosted Voltaire, Rousseau, and later Robespierre. These places gave voice to grievances, space for new philosophies, and momentum to political upheaval. In the right hands, a cup of coffee was more powerful than a sword. Even in the American colonies, coffee began replacing tea, especially after the Boston Tea Party in 1773. Drinking coffee became a quiet act of rebellion. The Continental Congress met over coffee. Soldiers brewed it by campfire. George Washington was said to be an avid drinker. While tea was associated with British rule, coffee was becoming the drink of American independence. But what made coffee so uniquely revolutionary? It wasn't just the caffeine, though, that certainly helped. It was the setting. Coffee houses didn't require membership, titles, or wealth. It welcomed conversation. In a world ruled by monarchs and rigid class systems, the cafe was a democratizing force, one cup at a time. By the end of the 18th century, coffee had firmly rooted itself not just in culture, but in history. It had helped spark revolutions, inspired manifestos, and shaped the very way people gathered in thought. And still, the journey was only halfway complete. As coffee's popularity exploded across Europe, so too did the thirst for control over its production. The bitter bean, once sacred and local, now became a global commodity, and like sugar, tea, and cotton, it was swept up in the vast machinery of colonialism. The 18th and 19th centuries saw European empires racing to cultivate coffee in far-flung lands, reshaping entire ecosystems and societies to fuel the world's growing addiction. The Dutch had already made a head start, cultivating coffee successfully in Java, Indonesia, by the late 1600s. From there, coffee spread like wildfire across the colonial world. The French planted it in the Caribbean, particularly on the island of Saint-Domingue, present-day Haiti, while the Portuguese introduced it to Brazil. Spain took it to Central America. Wherever the climate permitted, coffee followed, carried not by explorers, but by imperial ambition. But this expansion came at a price. Behind every plantation was a system of brutal labor, often enslaved, later indentured, forced to harvest beans under oppressive conditions. On the lush hillsides of Brazil and the Caribbean, fortunes were made, but at the cost of human suffering. Coffee was profit, and profit silenced conscience. Brazil, in particular, emerged as a coffee giant. By the mid-1800s, it was supplying over half of the world's coffee, a dominance it still maintains today. The sprawling plantations called fazendas became symbols of both wealth and inequality, powered by slavery until its abolition in 1888, the last in the Americas. Meanwhile, in Africa, coffee returned to its birthplace, but not as a homecoming. European colonizers introduced commercial plantations in Ethiopia, Kenya, and beyond, often disrupting traditional ways of life. Local farmers were pushed into cash crop economies, growing coffee for export rather than food for survival. Despite these shadows, coffee was deeply woven into the cultural fabric of these regions. In Ethiopia, the traditional coffee ceremony remained a cornerstone of hospitality. In Latin America, it became a lifeline, both economic and spiritual. By the end of the 19th century, coffee was no longer just a beverage. It was a global empire, one built on contradiction. A drink that connected continents and cultures, but also mirrored the injustices of the time. The bean had conquered the world. Now it was ready to evolve once more as the 19th century gave way to the 20th. Coffee began to shift again from a colonial export to a modern necessity. Urbanization, industrialization, and new technology transformed not just how people drank coffee, but what it meant to them. In factories and offices, train stations, and street corners, coffee became the fuel of the modern worker. No longer just for intellectuals and aristocrats, it now belonged to everyone. Central to this transformation was the invention of the espresso machine. In 1901, Italian engineer Luigi Bezzera patented a method for forcing pressurized water through finely ground coffee, dramatically speeding up brewing time. What had taken minutes now took seconds. The espresso was born, dark, concentrated, and invigorating, and with it came a whole new way of drinking. Cafes in Milan and Rome became the birthplace of this revolution. Unlike the slow, thoughtful pace of Ottoman or Enlightenment or coffee houses, espresso culture was brisk, efficient, and bold. Italians stood at counters, took their shot of espresso, exchanged a few words, and moved on. It was coffee for the modern age, fast, strong, and unapologetically direct. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, coffee was becoming the heartbeat of American life. Mass production made it accessible and affordable. In 1900, Hills Brothers began selling vacuum-packed coffee in tins, extending shelf life and expanding reach. During both World Wars, American soldiers were issued instant coffee in their rations, gritty, bitter, and beloved nonetheless. Coffee became a symbol of comfort and routine amid chaos. By mid-century, the world saw the rise of the diner, the percolator, and the break room. Coffee was everywhere, in thermoses, on job sites, in paper cups on commuter trains, in kitchens, humming with morning radio. It was no longer a ceremony or a luxury. It was a lifeline. But as convenience took over, something was lost. Instant coffee dominated, but often at the expense of quality. The deep, complex flavors of roasted beans were muted. For many, coffee had become background noise, a necessity rather than an experience. Still, the bean waited. Its next evolution would come not from technology or empire, but from a growing desire to rediscover its soul. A quieter revolution was brewing, one that would take coffee back to its roots, one careful pour at a time. By the late 20th century, coffee had reached near universal saturation. It was in every kitchen, office, and gas station, a dependable, if unremarkable, companion to daily life. But beneath the convenience and routine, a quiet rebellion was stirring, a movement that sought to treat coffee not as a commodity, but as a craft. Thus began what would come to be known as the third wave of coffee. Unlike the first wave, which prioritized access and mass production, or the second wave, which introduced cafe culture through giants like Starbucks, the third wave was about reverence. It treated coffee like wine, a product of terroir care and complexity. Small roasters, independent cafes, and curious drinkers began asking new questions. Where was this bean grown? Who grew it? How was it roasted? What flavors could be unlocked? This wave began in places like Portland, Oslo, Melbourne, and Tokyo, cities where a new generation of roasters experimented with light roasts, single-origin beans, and alternative brewing methods. Chemex, AeroPress, siphon brewers' tools once reserved for laboratories now appeared on cafe counters, inviting drinkers to slow down and engage. Baristas became artisans. Cuppings replaced quick sips. Coffee was no longer just about caffeine. It was about experience, ethics, and education. Central to this movement was transparency and sustainability. Roasters began forming direct relationships with farmers, bypassing exploitative middlemen. Labels on bags now read like stories, details about elevation, processing methods, and tasting notes. This wasn't just marketing. It was a shift in consciousness. Coffee was no longer anonymous. It had a name, a place, a face. But the third wave also brought tension. Prices rose. Tastes changed. What had once been considered good, coffee dark, rich, strong, was now challenged by floral, acidic profiles that confused traditional palates. Some saw the movement as elitist or overly precious. Others embraced it as a long overdue correction. Still, the core idea remained powerful. Coffee is more than a morning fix. It is culture, agriculture, chemistry, and art, all in one cup. And as more people discovered this, the global conversation around coffee deepened. It wasn't just about how coffee was made. It was about how it made people feel. From bean to brew, the journey was now personal. And the cup had never tasted more alive. Throughout history, coffee has been more than just a beverage. It has been a catalyst for thought, creation, and rebellion. Wherever it has gone, it has found itself at the heart of movements, revolutions, and artistic awakenings. More than wine, more than tea, coffee has been the drink of the restless mind. In the salons of Enlightenment-era Paris, it fueled the philosophies of Voltaire, and in the smoky cafes of Vienna, it inspired composers like Beethoven, who reportedly measured his morning coffee by counting out exactly 60 beans per cup. Artists, writers, and intellectuals gathered over their brews, arguing over truth, beauty, and the chaos of the world. In London, Charles Dickens and other Victorian novelists turned to coffee houses for both inspiration and observation. These places weren't quiet retreats. They were living theaters of society. As the centuries turned, the tradition held firm. In 20th century New York, coffee coursed through the veins of the Beat generation. Jack Kerouac, Allen Ginsberg, and others scribbled furiously in cafes that never seemed to sleep. In Seattle, long before it became a Starbucks capital, small, independent coffee shops were hangouts for grunge musicians and struggling poets, all chasing something real, something raw. Coffee didn't just accompany creativity. It accelerated it. The gentle buzz sharpened thoughts, lifted moods, and extended conversations deep into the night. Where alcohol might blur, coffee clarified. It offered a focused kind of euphoria, a feeling of being awake, not just physically, but spiritually, mentally. And then there were the revolutions. From French rebels in the 18th century to anti-colonial thinkers in 20th century Africa and Latin America, coffee houses have often doubled as unofficial headquarters for change. In Cuba, Fidel Castro and his revolutionaries drank thick cafecito in the mountains. In Algeria, resistance against French occupation brewed in smoky cafes that doubled as political salons. Coffee served hot and black was often the last comfort before action. Today, cafes remain creative sanctuaries. Writers with laptops, musicians with notebooks, artists sketching strangers from corners, all drawn to the atmosphere of slow time and gentle stimulation. A place where the outside world pauses and the mind, powered by a simple being, is free to wander. In every era, coffee has asked the same quiet question, what if? And countless minds have answered as we sip our lattes and pour our cold brews. It's easy to forget that coffee ancient, global, deeply loved now, faces an uncertain future. Climate change, economic inequality, and overconsumption threaten every part of the bean's journey. And yet, like the resilient plant it comes from, coffee continues to adapt, evolve, and find new ground. One of the biggest threats is environmental. Arabica coffee, the species that makes up over 60% of the world's supply, is extremely sensitive to temperature and altitude. Rising global temperatures and erratic rainfall patterns have already begun to shrink viable growing regions. Diseases like coffee, leaf rust, and pests like the coffee borer beetle are thriving in the changing climate, devastating farms from Central America to East Africa. In response, scientists and farmers are working together to develop more resilient strains of coffee. Hybrid plants, shaded cultivation techniques, and regenerative farming practices are being embraced in an effort to preserve both yield and quality. Still, it's a race against time and against indifference. On the economic front, coffee's global popularity often masks the reality that most coffee farmers live on the edge of poverty. Price volatility in global markets means smallholder farmers are often paid less than the cost of production. In response, there's a growing push for fair trade, direct trade, and transparent sourcing. Consumers, more informed than ever, are beginning to ask not just how their coffee tastes, but who grew it and under what conditions. Technology is also reshaping coffee's future. From app-controlled homebrewers to precision roasting algorithms, we're entering an era where science and craft blend seamlessly. Artificial intelligence is even being used to detect flavor profiles and recommend brewing methods. Yet, amidst all this innovation, the heart of coffee remains the same: connection, comfort, and conversation. Culturally, we're seeing a beautiful global cross-pollination. Japanese pour-over techniques influence baristas in Paris. Ethiopian coffee ceremonies are being revived in Western cafes. Cold brew from New York finds fans in Nairobi. The world of coffee is becoming smaller, but its diversity is blooming. So where does the journey go from here? Perhaps the real future of coffee lies not just in new technologies or climate solutions, but in remembering its roots in honoring the hands that harvest it, the rituals that preserve it, and the conversations it inspires. One cup at a time. In the wake of Rome's collapse, Europe splintered into a patchwork of warring kingdoms and vulnerable territories. The old order had vanished, and in its place rose a new one, harsh, unstable, and defined by violence. To survive in this fractured world, rulers relied on a new kind of warrior, the knight. But the first knights were not the noble, chivalrous figures we imagine today. They were hired muscle mercenaries on horseback, clad in chainmail, loyal not to virtue, but to gold and survival. These early knights were born from necessity. The stirrup, introduced from the East, allowed warriors to fight more effectively on horseback, and the feudal system gave them land in exchange for loyalty and arms. A lord would grant a fief to a man in return for military service. And soon, armored cavalry became the backbone of medieval warfare. Knights dominated battlefields with their speed and power, their status rising alongside their importance. Yet with that power came problems. Many knights became little more than warlords, raiding, extorting, and terrorizing local populations in the name of personal gain. Their unchecked violence troubled both secular leaders and the church. If knights were to hold such influence, they would need to be restrained not just by law, but by ethics. Thus began the slow birth of chivalry, not as pageantry or romantic fantasy, but as a practical solution to an urgent problem. The church, eager to tame these warrior elites, began to push a new narrative. Knights were not just enforcers, they were protectors. They were to defend the faith, safeguard the helpless, and fight with honor. The Crusades played a major role in transforming the knight's image. When Christian forces marched to reclaim the Holy Land in the late 11th century, knights were painted not as mere fighters, but as sacred warriors. They bore crosses on their chests and were blessed before battle. Their swords were consecrated, their missions framed as divine duty. And so the idea of the knight began to evolve. No longer just a soldier on horseback, he became a symbol. A man bound not only by feudal ties, but by ideals. Strength, yes, but tempered with restraint. Vengeance checked by mercy. Power ruled by virtue. The blade was still sharp, but now it served something higher. The code of chivalry was never etched in stone, nor dictated by a single king or council. It evolved over centuries, a fusion of warrior customs, Christian morality, and courtly ideals. But even without a central document, The message was clear. A knight was to be more than a killer in armor. He was to be a model of discipline, virtue, and protection. At its core, chivalry demanded loyalty to one's lord, one's comrades, and one's word. A knight's oath, once given, was sacred. To betray it was to betray his very identity. Honor, too, was central. Not the honor of vanity or pride, but the quiet, unwavering commitment to doing what was right, even when no one watched. Courage was expected, but not recklessness. A true knight was to be brave in the face of danger, yes, but also wise enough to avoid needless violence. He was to fight only when the cause was just, and only as a last resort. Humility stood alongside strength. A knight was to know his place before God, never boasting of victories or power. He was to lift others, not crush them. The protection of the weak, especially women, children, the elderly, and the poor, was not charity, but duty. The sword existed, not to dominate, but to defend. Courtesy was more than table manners. It meant treating others, even enemies, with dignity. A captured foe was to be spared if he yielded. A defeated knight deserved mercy, not mockery. This restraint in war was radical for its time and helped distinguish knights from common soldiers. Then came piety. The knight's faith was not to be mere ritual. He was to live as a servant of God, upholding Christian values both in battle and in peace. This spiritual aspect of chivalry gave the code weight. It wasn't just about human law, but divine accountability. Yet, despite its nobility, the code of chivalry was often more ideal than reality. Many knights fell short, plundering villages, waging private feuds, or chasing power at the expense of principle. Still, the code endured as a moral compass, a standard by which to measure a man's worth. It asked not just how strong is your sword, but what do you fight for? Knighthood was not granted lightly. To become a knight was a long, disciplined journey, one that shaped not just a warrior's skill, but his soul. It began in childhood, not on the battlefield, but in the quiet halls of a noble household, where boys learned first to serve before they could command. At the age of 7, a noble-born boy was sent away from his family to become a page. This was his first step toward knighthood. Life as a page was filled with discipline. He learned table manners, reading, Latin prayers, and the basics of etiquette. But it wasn't all formality. Pages also trained in physical agility, riding horses, and basic swordplay. Most importantly, they learned obedience. A knight, after all, had to follow orders before he could give them. By his early teens, the page would become a squire. This was a time of intense training, both martial and moral. Under the watchful eye of an older knight, the squire learned the art of combat, jousting, swordsmanship, archery, and the care of armor and steeds. He would accompany his knight into battle, not to fight, but to serve. He cleaned weapons, tended wounds, and absorbed the code in action. In the fire of war, he witnessed both the glory and the horror that knighthood demanded. But it wasn't all about war. Squires were expected to learn music, poetry, and the refined behavior of the court. They practiced public speaking, letter writing, and the art of courtly love, the chivalric devotion to a noble lady, often idealized and unattainable. These lessons shaped the knight, not only as a fighter, but as a man of grace and wisdom. When the squire proved himself through battle, loyalty, or years of steadfast service, he was finally deemed worthy of knighthood. The ceremony was solemn. He would bathe in symbolic purification, spend a night in prayer, and confess his sins. Then at dawn he would kneel before his lord or king, who would tap him on the shoulders with a sword, the accolade. With those silent strikes, he was no longer a boy learning the code. He was the code, alive and armored. Becoming a knight was more than a promotion. It was a rite of passage filled with ritual, symbolism, and sacred meaning. At a time when most of the world was ruled by violence and uncertainty, the ceremony of knighthood brought clarity, a line drawn between raw force and disciplined virtue. It was the moment a man didn't just wield a sword, he became responsible for what it was used for. The process began with purification. On the eve of his knighting, the squire would take a ritual bath, not merely for cleanliness, but to symbolize the washing away of past sins. Afterward, he dressed in a white tunic to represent purity, a red robe for courage, and a black cloak for humility, and his readiness to die in service. He would then enter a chapel for a solemn vigil. Alone or with others, he knelt before the altar, his sword resting beside him, and prayed through the night. This vigil was more than tradition. It was a final moment of reflection. When dawn came, he would no longer be a boy of service, but a man of oath. At sunrise, the formal ceremony began. A priest blessed the sword, asking God to guide its use for justice, not cruelty. A noble or king, sometimes a relative, performed the accolade, a light tap on each shoulder with the flat of a blade. With that gesture, the squire became a knight, but the words spoken mattered just as much as the steel. The knight swore an oath to protect the innocent, to remain loyal to his lord, to uphold the truth, to defend the faith. These vows varied by region and century, but the spirit remained the same. The sword was no longer his alone. It belonged to something greater. Gifts often followed: a sword, a horse, spurs, or even a ring. Celebrations were held, feasts thrown in honor of the newly dubbed knight. Yet amid the joy, the weight of the commitment was never forgotten. To break his oath meant more than disgrace. It meant spiritual peril. Knighthood was not granted with wealth or lineage alone. It had to be earned. And once earned, it was carried like armor, visible or not, until death thought to be a knight was to live by the sword, but also to restrain it. On the battlefield, where chaos reigned and blood was cheap, the code of chivalry asked for something rare: control. Knights were trained to fight with deadly precision, but the code demanded they temper brutality with justice and vengeance with mercy. In the heat of war, this was no small task. Knights fought in brutal campaigns, crusades, border wars, and feudal conflicts where lives were measured in moments. Yet even there, chivalry held power. Knights were expected to give quarter to a defeated enemy. If a fellow noble yielded, he could be spared, taken prisoner, and ransomed rather than slain. This wasn't only compassion, it was custom. A knight's life had value, and that value was respected, even in war. The code also prohibited unnecessary destruction. Knights were discouraged from harming non-combatants, especially women, children, clergy, and peasants. The battlefield was seen as a test of strength and honor between equals, not a license for cruelty. Of course, reality often fell short. Atrocities occurred, oaths were broken, and entire towns suffered. But when that happened, even in the Middle Ages, the dishonor lingered. A knight who violated the code risked his reputation and his soul. Chivalry also governed behavior before and after battles. A knight was expected to announce himself, display his coat of arms, and never strike a fellow noble from behind. Surprise and deception were tactics of lesser men. A true knight fought openly, giving his enemy the dignity of seeing death approach. Tournaments offered a controlled version of this ideal. In the lists, knights competed not to kill, but to demonstrate their prowess, jousting, dueling, and displaying grace under pressure. These spectacles celebrated chivalric values, reinforcing the belief that might and virtue could walk side by side. And in victory, the knight was to be gracious. He might lift his opponent to his feet, offer a hand, or even help bind wounds. Honor didn't end when the battle did. In fact, that was when it mattered most. For the knight, war was not a blood sport. It was a sacred duty, and how he fought revealed who he truly was. Though the knight was forged in battle, his identity was equally shaped by ideals far from the battlefield, by music, poetry, and the delicate dance of devotion known as courtly love. In the medieval imagination, a true knight was not only a warrior, but a gentleman, a servant of honor and beauty, particularly in the presence of noble women. Courtly love was a cultural movement that emerged in the courts of southern France in the 12th century. Influenced by troubadours, poets, and the refinement of aristocratic life, it elevated romantic longing into a chivalric obligation. A knight, it was believed, should choose a lady, often married or socially unattainable, and dedicate himself to her service not through possession or conquest, but through loyalty, restraint, and noble suffering. This love was rarely consummated. It was idealized, spiritual, and symbolic. The lady became the muse, the knight her humble vassal. He would wear her favor into battle a ribbon, a token, and draw strength from her image. Songs were written, poems composed, quests undertaken, all in her name. In this way, the knight's sword was guided not only by honor, but by longing. But this was more than romance. It was a code within a code, a refinement of behavior. Courtly love demanded grace, patience, humility, and eloquence. It softened the edges of the warrior's life, reminding him that strength alone was not enough. To be truly noble, one must be gentle. Women, too, held power in this dynamic, though they were often excluded from political and military roles. Noble women could influence events through their position, their wit, and their role as guardians of chivalric standards. A lady might grant or deny her favor, offer public praise, or demand that a knight act with greater virtue. In the courtly world, her approval shaped reputations. Of course, this ideal often clashed with reality. Not every knight was noble, and not every romance pure, but the stories endured of Lancelot and Guinevere, Tristan and Isolde, tales where love and duty collided, often tragically. In the chivalric imagination, the lady represented more than affection. She symbolized the soul of the knight, the part he fought for, longed for, and could never quite reach. While chivalry emphasized honor, restraint, and devotion, one of its deepest pillars was loyalty, not just to lords or ladies, but to one another. In a world of shifting alliances, feudal rivalries, and constant warfare, the bond between knights was more than camaraderie. It was survival. It was trust in steel and soul. Knights were rarely solitary figures. They rode in companies, served in retinues, and lived in close quarters for months, even years. In such settings, a quiet but unbreakable brotherhood often formed. These men trained together, bled together, and rode side by side into battle. Each knew that the man to his left might be the only thing standing between him and death. Loyalty to one's lord was central to the chivalric ideal. A knight's oath to his liege bound him not just to service, but to sacrifice, In return, the lord was expected to offer protection, land, and honor. This relationship, sealed by solemn vows and often witnessed by clergy, was sacred. Breaking it was not just betrayal, it was treason. But equally powerful were the informal bonds between knights themselves. Friendships forged in battlefields and tournament fields became lifelong alliances. A knight was expected to stand by his comrades, defend their names, and if need be, avenge their deaths. Reputation wasn't built alone. It was sustained by the respect of peers. Orders of knighthood, such as the Knights Templar or the Hospitallers, took this brotherhood even further. These were religious military communities bound by strict vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience. Their loyalty was to each other and to God above all else. Within these orders, the ideals of chivalry were not just practiced, they were enforced, cultivated, and turned into a way of life. This code of mutual respect extended even to enemies. It was not uncommon for knights on opposing sides to show admiration for each other's bravery or to treat captured foes with dignity. A worthy enemy could still be a brother in arms, divided by loyalty, but united by the code. In the end, a knight's honor wasn't just measured by how he served his lord or loved his lady. It was revealed in how he stood by his brothers. When the arrows flew, the banners fell, and only loyalty remained.